go. All right. So again, thanks all for joining the manual update overview. Again, today is an overview of the updates to the UVA manual. We'll be talking about the process to get here, the goals of the manual update, and an overview of some of the kinds of changes that you'll see in these revisions. I want to stress right out of the gate, it's a draft. It needs work. In the background of the draft, you've got, there are still a ton of track changes. We're still working on fine tuning the language that we've got in some of it and some of the elements. I know that the last time that the manual was updated, I think I joined as a consultant at the building in Waterbury, the state complex. And remember that there was part of that process. Our department may have gone a little too far down the track in refining the final changes of the manual before engaging the consulting community. That's why we're taking this approach this time, in part because we really want to get folks engaged earlier rather than later. And so things are in flux, and please bring your input in that way, recognizing that we really do want your input. We're not going to be able to take all of it, but I think our work is a lot better if it's informed by your ideas, your thoughts, concerns, and recommendations. So as I mentioned earlier, today is a venue to get familiar with the background and goals of this. This is not the beginning of the process, of the public engagement process. I'll speak more to that in a bit. But this is the part where we're really expanding it out more broadly. We're going to be accepting ongoing feedback until February 16th. We really do encourage you to write to me. I might provide more detail as we figure out the best approach for that. But in the meantime, I'm compiling emails, stuff like that. I've already gotten a handful, and they're really helpful. At the same time, some of these are hard to, some of the changes that you might be responding to or thinking about might benefit from a conversation. I welcome that. Please don't hesitate to give me a call or set up a meeting if you're interested to talk through and better understand the background and the thinking behind some of this. Again, next Wednesday on January 24th at the Canadian Club in Barrie at 8:30 a.m. We're going to be having a meeting on this. I'll talk a little bit more about that, but that'll be a good chance to dig in more deeply and provide input and discuss some of these things, both with FPRA and Private Lands Advisory Committee members.
Keith, there's a question. Is the meeting at the Canadian Club going to be recorded?
It's a great question. I've been asked that. My instinct is no. And the reason for that is because while it would be valuable, this isn't going to be a presentation. This is going to be a conversation, many small conversations, and I just don't see how we'll be able to effectively record that in a way that allows people to observe it through a video recording or engage in it remotely. So a little bit of an overview for the presentation, give an introduction to what we're working on, some background to the process. We'll talk about some of the role that Private Lands Advisory Committee has had and some perspectives from their side of it. We'll dig into some of the goals of the manual, do an overview of some of the changes, highlight some of the examples of what has changed and why, and at the end we'll have a chance for some broad questions. During that time, those questions, I think that we may bring up some specific examples to consider but we won't dig into the specifics. Be working on line editing the manual at this stage, though that is going to be a needed step down the road. So, administration of the current use program, delivery of the program in the state is one of the most valuable things the private lands program and FPR does for our forests. I think for the public, um, we've got 70% of eligible acres enrolled, 55% of eligible parcels are enrolled. It's a massive aggregate impact, and the connections we make to consulting foresters, to landowners, the work we do on the ground, the values it provides for forests, for wildlife, biodiversity, water quality, carbon, the list goes on, uh, is just, I feel really proud to be part of it. I feel really honored to be able to do this with all of you. It is one of the most important things we do. There's a lot of other important work we do that is complemented by administration of the use value appraisal program. The work that we do with consulting foresters in the woods, the learning we do together, the problems we solve, the questions we ask each other, the debates we get into, the successes we share and failures that we share is incredibly valuable. And when I talk to the county foresters, it is some of the most valuable and appreciated elements of our work. This is separate from processing FMARs or forest management plans or transfer paperwork. While that's important to advance those UVA goals, and we recognize that that is critical to the success of the program, this on the ground work with you, the honest conversations we have, is something that we value deeply. In addition, walking with landowners, getting to see the woods through their eyes, helping them see the woods through ours, and helping them realize their goals on the ground. Something we do, it's something you do. It's incredibly valuable. It is, again, it's supported by the forest management plans that get written. But the walks in the woods, talking to a lot of folks, that's where a ton of the really valuable work occurs. The outreach and education that we do with events and helping connect folks to the forest in ways they might not otherwise connect with it offers a lot of value and helps people see forests in a new light, helps them see forestry in a new light and consider the opportunities that they have and that we have collectively to take care of our forests. The work we do demonstrating forest management and making forest management accessible and transparent and being able to tell this story in a way that is understandable and compelling, and they can recognize their own values being realized through the management that's getting done on the ground is really valuable. I think not just for the individuals, but culturally, we know that there's a shift in the way that people view forests, what it's supposed to be providing for the public, and how we realize those goals. And I think in a lot of respects, we have a lot of opportunities to tell those stories better than we have. And doing that well is also really valuable work that complements the work of UVA. Other layers of the work that we really think are valuable, engaging youth on the ground to help them see the connection between the work in the woods and their everyday lives. This is an example of a project that Corey was closely involved in, helping tech students manage a forest and get wood milled for a Brandon Library renovation project. These kinds of projects take a ton of effort, but they are experiences that are extremely rare for people today and provide a lot of value that carries, that's really a lifelong experience, that isn't going to go away. This is valuable work that we need to be doing. You might be wondering why I'm sharing all that. And one of the reasons that I'm sharing that is because our interactions, uh, the interactions of county foresters and consulting foresters, is often focused through the lens of UVA plan review, which takes a ton of administrative work. And at sometimes, unfortunately, I think that we haven't done a good job telling the story of where we see the most valuable work. And to the point that I've heard from some consulting foresters, the the perception that we enjoy kicking back plans, or we enjoy increasing our authority, so to speak. I speak to all this really valuable work that we do to really emphasize that's not the case. We really need UVA to work well. There are a ton of demands associated with administration of UVA. And we'll get into some of those details. But I want to stress that the ability of the county foresters to both administrate UVA well in a way that works for the forests, for landowners, for consulting foresters, for FPR, that's the baseline. But to the extent that we can do that and expand our ability to be out in the woods with you, be out in the woods with landowners, educating landowners in events, doing outreach work, doing work with the youth to help them connect to forests and forestry. That's our goal. We want to make that more possible than it is today. So all these parcels in green that are enrolled in UVA, every one of those has a corresponding workload. And to put this into perspective, this is work that comes to you, it comes to us. Since 2003, we've had a 43% increase in UVA enrollments, in acres enrolled. We've had a 70% increase in the parcels enrolled. We all know that there's a baseline amount of work for every parcel in terms of application, transfer paperwork, things like that. And two 50-acre parcels is not the same amount of work. It's much more work than one 100-acre parcel. And so this is a trend, is we're not gaining capacity. You aren't gaining capacity, we aren't gaining capacity, but we are getting many more parcels enrolled in the program. And to further stress this, you've seen this, but I think it's good to think about how we shift the program as in light of these trends. The rate of enrollment hasn't gone down for, excuse me, the total enrollment hasn't gone down for a long time. The rate of enrollment is slowing down a little bit, but it continues to increase. So the conversation about what we need to do with the manual, some of the changes that we need to make, it goes back at least 8 years. The last manual update was in 2010. It's interesting. In some ways it's positive, in some ways it's negative. 8 years ago, there was a conversation with a group of consulting foresters, starting nearly when I came into this position in 2015. We compiled a bunch of recommendations. This snapshot is from a 2017 consulting forester meeting where we talked with the consulting forester community, I think in Randolph, about a template. What are some of the considerations? I think we had 80 people at that meeting. And so this is not, even though this most recent iteration started in earnest in the summer of 2023, we have been pulling resources, pulling information from consulting foresters, from past work, going back years and years. And many of you have been involved in this. So to highlight this a bit more, the manual update process really, I think, began in earnest in 2017. Private Lands Advisory Committee was formed, and consultants provided input on the template, both in small working groups, in a predecessor working group to Private Lands Advisory Committee, as well as during the consulting forester meeting in 2017. 2018 and 2019, PLAC and FPR were really working in earnest on developing a template. We were imagining an online submission portal that would have a pretty structured way to collect plan elements and so on. Ultimately, the template was put on hold due to COVID and some of the issues related to the electronic submission process for that level of detail that we ran into with IT. Fast forward to last summer, we were recognizing, especially with the release of the reserve forest land standards, that for several years we've been digging a hole of disparate standards. We'll speak a little bit more to that, but reserve forest land is a very large body of standards that stands outside of the UVA manual, and any consulting forester or county forester who's trying to say, what is required for this program? How do I help people recognize what's necessary and hold folks accountable to meeting the standards consistent with statute? You are in a tough spot given the way our standards are kind of spread out. So working this summer, we pulled that information together. In the fall of 2023, the Private Lands Advisory Committee identified the manual update goals and components and established a subcommittee. During the fall, from September to December, Private Lands Advisory Subcommittee was meeting bi-weekly to refine the manual and plan components with a parallel FPR process. Many aspects of that were pulling in information both from previous iterations of Private Lands Advisory Committee and the input of the consulting foresters into that process. And then in December and January of this year, FPR is reviewing the PLAC draft manual and the plan standards for the draft. So that's a bit of a background for where things have been. But I can't stress enough how valuable it's been for the Private Lands Advisory Committee to be providing input on this process, asking questions, really stressing priorities, concerns, motivations, things like that. So they've been very, very closely engaged on this process, strong advocates for doing the manual update, and really strong advocates for doing it well in ways that strike the right balance for FPR's needs of landowners and consulting foresters and forestry as a whole. Right now, the members of Private Lands Advisory Committee are Richard Carbonetti, Andy Carlo, Seth Clifford, Sarah Ford, Tony Lamberton, Joe Nelson, Dave Senio, Andy Shear, Ken Brown, Al Robertson. We do have a vacancy. Steve Long stepped down, so we've got to fill that spot. And there might be a little transition in the coming months with some of the other forestry members. But Corey Cregan and Robert Nelson sit on it as well to provide some on-the-ground FPR perspective. But with that, I would like to pass this off briefly to Carbo. Carbo's serving as the as the chair of Private Lands Advisory Committee, and there are some, I think, sharing his and Plaque's take on the approach, the goals, the process, might be helpful. So, Carbo, are you there?
I am.
Great.
Well, great. Good morning, folks. Keith, thanks for that introduction, and thank everyone for participating in this. I've been involved with current use since its inception. Sadly, in my 46th year of consulting, as I like to say, I'm in that's an age class of the forestry community. But one of the reasons I got involved with this is that we complained for years that we didn't get a chance to have input. And, when Commissioner Snyder created Plaque, and with the support now of Commissioner Fitzko, this is a really effective way of getting private sector comments into these discussions prior to decisions being made. And I think it's created a much more collaborative and effective relationship between the private sector and Forest and Parks. I think we all recognize that the manual needed an update. It wasn't just because of new programs, but documents need to be updated to reflect on current conditions. They're always a dynamic process. They need to be, worked on periodically. And so this was identified a number of years ago when we had the UVA subcommittee. There was a lot of concerns about the manual, so led to this process. So I thought I'd go over sort of what we all identified as the goals of this process. And a lot of this came from, all of us who work with current use from both sides of the equation, some of the stumbling blocks, the inefficiencies, the time involved with getting plans approved. So first was to just update and reflect on all the current regulations and standards. We now have the Reserve Forest Program. That's Keith indicated. It's not in the manual. It should be. Create a more user-friendly, organized format that will enable consultants to prepare plans that meet all the program's requirements. I think we can all agree that the old manual was a little bit cumbersome and difficult. It wasn't well organized, and it needed to be really restructured. Address ambiguous or unclear language, terms, and standards. This has been a major driver, and the single largest concern Plaque has heard is the back and forth on plan review. If you don't have clear standards, it's difficult for two parties to agree on what's acceptable. And that we've heard that from everyone involved with current use on both sides of the equation. Then develop a clearly objective set of standards to facilitate objective reviews of submitted plans by county foresters. The goal being to set consistent standards for consultants while avoiding potentially subjective calls on the parts of county foresters, to achieve a level playing field of standards leading to an objective process, and also so that as a consultant working with your client, you know what to expect, what the process is going to entail. You can build your budget and explain to your client, what's going to happen. On the county forester side, as Keith indicated, the workload's enormous. And, we all agree that we'd much rather have county foresters out with us in the woods than sitting behind their desks reviewing plans. So hopefully this process will speed that up and enable that to happen. A consistent plan format to enable county foresters to have an efficient review process. One of the things we heard consistently is with the number of consultants and every one of us delivering a somewhat different format, it takes a lot of time to find all the components that are required to meet an approved plan. So hopefully this process is going to create a more structured format that will allow that to be a much more effective and efficient process. So we also wanted to create a system where all the scattered standards are placed in an ordered system under each program option. So again, this becomes a clearer checklist process. So I'm entering traditional standard forestry. I need these categories. I check them off. I deliver that goods. I know that I've completed the task. The way it is now, it was a little more difficult to accomplish that. Then create a format that would enable the development of the digital plan template. Eventually the goal of the department is to have, online submissions of plans in a format that is, you click this box, you know what you have to put in it. Everybody delivers the same product to the county foresters. Again, a step in efficiency, and then there's records online. It hopefully will make the whole process more efficient. And then one of the things we've all discussed about current use is self-certification. Licensed foresters should be able to certify their plans. The department is considering, and I would say, and Keith, correct me if I'm wrong, have an element of a commitment to work through this process over time. And I think it's important that we felt getting a manual and a process in place that would allow for that to happen, especially since it's going to involve legislative action and other considerations, was an important goal of this process. Now, Keith's filled me in on some of the feedback he's getting, so I wanted to address that a little bit. So, did developing objective standards lead to a simplification of the standards? No, that was not necessarily the intent, or it was always possible. The intent was a manual providing an objective, clear, and unambiguous set of standards that would enable consultants and county foresters to have the same view of what is required to achieve an approved plan. Gather into a standard format various requirements previously scattered in various locations within the manual. That may provide the appearance of many new requirements. That's simply incorrect. Yes, there are some new, in particular with new programs, but a lot of it was taking all the elements of the current manual, lining them up, and there's 14, 15, 16 things you have to do. When you get them in a line, it looks like, what have we done? Have we created new requirements? No, we've just clarified that these are what the manual has said. These are what the program requires. In other instances, the intent or desired outcome of employed silviculture is a requirement, but without required specific data points. That has probably led to more back and forth with county foresters than anything else. So one of the things we've been working on is trying to filling in those gaps of data or language that will allow that to be a much more efficient process where the consultant's going to know what they need to present, and the county forester will say, yep, they presented that, they've met the requirements. In that fashion, the goal is for plans to be easier to develop, knowing what's required, and that would allow for, obviously, hopefully, easier review. I think the other critical goal is removing ambiguity, because I think that's where the subjective nature of review can sometimes fall. Oh, I thought I was saying this. Well, I don't hear that. And that gets into that, multiple emails back and forth with your county forester to finally get to, okay, now we're both on the same page. So clarifying data entry, providing the right data and explanations was a critical goal of this. Another critical factor, and I don't think we can avoid this, is that forestry is not a static science, and neither are the demands of the public to maintain this program. We are aware that UVA is almost annually, there's critics of the program. Why are we paying for this? Why do landowners get a tax break, even though it's really tax equity? So we needed to make sure that the standards reflected on the demands that the body politic were putting on the program. So yes, there are some things added that reflect changes in forest science, changes related to climate change, invasives. There's a number of factors that have come to bear on how we practice forestry that many of them didn't exist in 1979 when the program was started, nor even in 2010 when the last manual was updated. So these changes and considerations, program changes including new categories, forest reserve, sustainability issues, ecosystem services where appropriate, forest resources issues such as invasives, changes in forest practice, and clarity in UVA requirements such as the mandatory AMPs. That language was very open-ended, and we were hoping to tighten that up so that there was a clearer understanding how AMPs would be implemented and utilized on current use programs. So in summary, what we'd like to get used to the feedback on, have we achieved this? Objective was to update and improve the UVA manual, create a more objective and efficient plan preparation and review process, program requirements that are presented in a consistent and complete format, manual content to reflect current program options and updated forest science related to the program options and standards, and then finally provide a better basis for moving to self-certification. So I think what's been interesting is that both on PLAC and on the subcommittee, we have a diverse range of consultants, from single individuals working on, let's say smaller ownerships to some of us who manage larger landscapes. So there's been a broad and vigorous discussion at times about implications of costs, time, what it's going to take to get plans done. And I think ultimately we're making hopefully a trade-off of a clearer process that leads to a more efficient review process and ultimately gets us to a point where the relationship between county foresters and consultants is more productive and effective and allows both sides of that equation to fulfill all their responsibilities more effectively. Keith, I think, if there's, I don't know what you want to do for questions or process here, but I'll leave that up to you.
Yeah, I think it'd be great to open the door for any questions of you or Plaque, maybe for 5 minutes or so if folks do have questions. There will be a chance at the end as well. Okay, great. I will speak to the self-certification aspect, because that's been something that we've heard at several consulting forester meetings, really since licensing came to be. I think we're at a place where we are really interested in committing to exploring if self-certification can work, and we're really hopeful that it can. I think that there are some prerequisites to making that final call on our our determination that this is in the interest of the program and of landowners and forestry broadly. But we see a path, and some of the things that we imagine would be necessary to put in place all seem possible, and we see a lot of potential benefits if we can do it well together. But that really requires a shared commitment to taking those steps, and included among that, or within that, is really a high level of plan integrity and transparency in terms of what's being implemented. Some of the changes in this program or in the manual help to advance that. I'm going to jump back into my presentation and we'll talk a little bit more about FPR's perspective on some of this. So as Carbo was saying, pulling together the disparate standards is one of the most kind of mechanical, fundamental aspects of this manual revision. We've got, since the last manual update in 2010, signature guidance, sugarbush standards, irregular shelterwood guidance, extension standards, ag conversion standards, guidance for open land. The list goes on. And then we have the UVA manual, and we need to bring them all under the same roof so that people can have clear guidance and clear understanding about what is required, and not pointed to some other document that is in conflict or in addition to standards that they reasonably believe to be in effect. I think this gets to some of the efficiency process, and part of why some of these changes, like the precision in the language in the manual and having a template, are really necessary for self-certification. The county foresters review 2,000 plans a year, updates and new enrollments. That's not including all the transfers and withdrawals and so on that are also processed. Of those 2,000 plans, 25% are returned for edits. So that's 500 plans are going back from the county forester to the plan preparer for a variety of reasons. Sometimes it's basic omissions. Sometimes it's significant omissions or errors. Sometimes it's because the county forester couldn't find the information, but it was already there. And so there are a variety of very specific reasons why these plans are returned. And if we can take that number down, that's a huge savings for the county foresters. It's also a huge savings, an increase in predictability for consulting foresters, and timeliness for landowners, and all that comes with that. For every one of these plans that gets returned, there's the financial cost, there's the time cost. There's also a real relationship cost, and how we engage and interact on in our work. And to the extent that we can reduce this component because we have a strong shared understanding of what's expected and how that's satisfied, we can really focus our attention more on growing and learning together and making progress in those areas. As Carbo mentioned, fair, effective, predictable delivery of the program is really important. Every plan requires a county forester and a plan preparer to come to a common understanding. The manual, the standards, provide the basis for that shared understanding. And if there is a chance that the standards can be interpreted differently by either party, then there's a high likelihood that there's going to be a misalignment. It's kind of crazy to me to think there's 150 consulting foresters, there's 13 county foresters. There are 2,000 opportunities for misalignment in that in that universe, because you've got 100 each consulting forester. In the ideal world, might be able to bring the same plan to this for the same property to each county forester and have a common response and a common review. And right now, the way the manual is written, that's very difficult to do. And so that's why we're changing many elements of the manual to help reduce the risk of that. It will never be eliminated. But I think that we can increase the clarity. In the webinar registration process, there was a chance for folks to share questions. And some of the questions, all of which were totally fair questions, but some of them were asking about, what are we doing about ag certification? What are we doing about mapping of farm buildings? Things like that. And the administration of the use value appraisal program is based in statute, based in rule. It's based in property valuation and review requirements for application and transfers and things like that, and the minimum acceptable standards for forest management. And statute outlines that there are certain standards adopted by the commissioner for administration of the forest land elements of the program. They're outside of the basic and universal enrollment requirements required for all properties. They're outside of the agricultural land, active agricultural land enrollment elements. They intersect for sure, but the authority and the work that we're doing here is focused on those standards largely, and bringing in and integrating some of the other intersecting elements of statute and other standards that are kind of shared between property valuation and review. And the mapping standards are a perfect example of that. FPR cannot independently change the mapping standards. That needs to be something that's a shared approach with PVR. It will be communicated in the manual because it's absolutely relevant, but it's not something that can be pursued independently by FPR. Whereas what's required for a silvicultural prescription in productive forest land, that is something that we have the discretion to, that the commissioner has the discretion to adopt through statute. So I think that's just helpful in understanding where's the wiggle room, what can we push on, and where do we need to pursue a different conversation to make changes. And it's not to say that some of those things like farm buildings or ag certification aren't worthy of discussion. It's just not through this process that those are going to be addressed. So as Carbo mentioned, there are several goals, and I want to highlight some of the areas in the manual that advance these goals, but I think these line up pretty well with what Carbo already shared. So we're looking to bring in disparate standards so requirements are more easily identified. improve the format and indexing of the manual to allow for efficient reference of standards, increase the clarity of the requirements to reduce back and forth review, create a template format for consistent review process, set things up to advance potential for self-certification, adapt program elements to advance statutory purposes consistent with shifts in the practice of forestry and sound stewardship. So I'm going to highlight some of the areas, and these are just going to be examples. They're not going to be comprehensive enumeration of the changes, but I want to my goal here is so that as you're looking through the manual and you're seeing a change, that you can perhaps better understand where that change might have come from, and go from there. So we're going to have a table of contents. Right, I need to figure out how to use Word better so that the structure of the table of contents is a little bit more clear in its hierarchy. But the goal here is to be able to say, I'm looking for this requirement. What's the requirement for plan updates? What are the extension standards? What are the sugar bush standards? Being able to go straight to that section in the manual. Right now, that's not readily doable. You can see in here where the red arrows are, those are examples of disparate standards that were separate from the UVA manual that are now baked in. There are several more as well. But that's one basic change. The general framework, and this is an example of why I want the table of contents to be more intuitive in its structure, but general approach starts with the overview. We go to eligibility. Then we've got a section on program compliance. What is the ongoing responsibility? A section on the management standards that apply to each enrolled parcel. And then management standards by enrollment category. For instance, the management standards for reserve forest land are different than the management standards for productive forest land. Then the remainder of the manual is really about the management plans. It starts with the format requirements, and then the rest of it is the detailed requirements. In this new structure, we're clear each plan has a cover page, a parcel overview, a stand summary, management objectives, and prescription elements. And then each of those sections has their own specific requirements, and it's concluded with mapping standards. I want to flag right now the mapping standards. As I mentioned before, those are a shared standard with property valuation and review. And so there's less independence in the refinement of those. There really needs to be alignment between both departments in those. But that's one of the goals. We'll also have an appendix to this. It will be less comprehensive than the existing appendix, because there are some, I think, unnecessary elements in the current appendix. But process guidance is going to be one section that I think is going to be very valuable for that, because the process, I think, is a little bit ambiguous for some folks. It's really important to have a document that articulates, here's how you go from I'm interested to I'm enrolled and what the expectations are moving forward. But some of those aren't standards per se. We'll have the deer browse index, site class by soils, site index guidance, some of those reference materials that are related to plan requirements. So digging into some of those specific examples of how some of those goals were met. And so I just wanted to flag format changes for clarity. You know, some folks are looking at the manual saying, wow, this is a lot of requirements. And it is a very different format. And in this new format, each of the requirements are enumerated, and there's a very clear, hopefully succinct and precise requirement attached to each one. And in this, I just wanted to contrast that with the current format. Number 15 here is basically the prescription requirements in the UVA manual. Each of the highlighted sections is a specific requirement related to a prescription. They're hard to pull apart, to recognize when is this required, when is it not. Another thing that we've recognized is we all know that there are treatment types, but when we're making a prescription, that prescription is often a narrative that includes a lot of different variables and considerations. In the new UVA manual, we're looking to incorporate some of those elements that would be included in a narrative as specific elements, and perhaps reducing the need for a narrative that is a bit harder to decipher, inject some more of that objectivity and precision so that both plan preparers and county foresters can be clear on what's required. There will always be sections where people can add that. It may be necessary for interpretation or communication of why something is appropriate, but may not always be required. One thing I want to share, and this is I still haven't figured out, we still haven't figured out how to incorporate this into the manual yet, but it's the format that Black and the county foresters have been working with when thinking about what is required for each, in this case, each prescription type. So if I'm prescribing a thinning, what's required for that? It's a little bit harder to decipher from the current structure of the manual. This barely fits on 11 by 17. There are other equivalent matrices that were 4 pages of 11 by 17, for example, for the stand descriptors. But I thought that this might be helpful for when you read through the manual, how you interpret, there's beneath each requirement for the stand descriptors in particular and the stand and the prescriptions. Some say it's required for all, and some say it's required for a specific treatment type. And that's what this points to, that if you're prescribing a thinning, there's a certain number of plan elements that you're required to include, and others that you're not required to include. So hopefully that helps you think about how to interpret the manual. I will continue to work on how we incorporate something like this as another way to review what's required for each treatment type or enrollment category. We also made some language changes for clarity, and to some extent the formatting changes are related. But here's an example where site class is provided. It says specify the soil series or site index. We've got a lot of stands that have multiple soil series. Do we provide one? Do we provide all? We've just got some modest language here to say list the dominant series affecting site potential and operability, so that it's clear that you can do more than one, but you don't need to list that one that's 0.5% and just happens to be included because of the mapping boundaries of the stand and the soil maps. Helps draw a clearer line of what the expectation is. Another example, stand cover type or equivalent, and then this is followed by percent species composition by basal area of dominant overstory. So this is the stand cover type. People are always providing the percent species composition and always providing the stand type. The current manual is structured as one standard. In reality, it's 2. We're also more clear about how the percent species composition is provided by basal area, and what should be included in that. Again, I want to stress, we may not have gotten all the details right. In fact, in this manual, I'm sure we didn't. We want your input on it. There are reasons for all of these decisions, I think that we've moved the needle towards a really solid place with many of these. We still want your input for them. Oh, excuse me. Some other examples: adapting program elements to advance program purposes. And this is also related to the evolution of forestry that Carbo mentioned, and where we're at today, what the public, what the legislature, what others expect from not just forestry, but also UVA. Depending on how you evaluate it, Property Valuation Review's recent report suggests that the program is costing $70 million between foregone revenue and payment to municipalities for those hold harmless payments. And so for many, being able to say, okay, this is a cost, it's big. They also recognize it's valuable. How is it advancing the stated program goals? Among them being natural resource values, things like that. And in the current standards, RT&E requirements aren't included, but I think as a forestry profession, it's something we need to put on the table and call out on properties that are enrolled. Not that we need to go overboard with it, but being silent on it is probably inappropriate. And so being able to flag if there are known RT&E species or natural communities, where are they and how are they going to be conserved? And I don't, when we say conserved in this context, it's not how are you going to put an easement on it, but how are you going to tend to that condition? This is new. I can recognize it can be delicate. That's an example of one area where touching on this is something we need to figure out. How do we do this meaningfully? How do we do it appropriately? Aquatic feature overview is another example. This is in the parcel overview section of the manual. And so just making sure that perennial streams and wetlands are on the map. That's already required in the mapping, but it hasn't really been called out. And so making sure those are identified. And one example of why that's valuable is that at times we have ag conversion recommendations. And ag conversion is something that is allowed. It's approved, can be approved. But there's also a requirement that state laws be followed. And at some frequency, there are ag conversions that are recommended where there are existing wetlands and things like that. And having these features mapped is really helpful to inform how do we do good management on the ground. We need to consider these features. And it isn't to prescribe exactly how things get done, but it is to make sure that they're on the radar and that they're part of the consideration. There have been questions about the template format, and wanted to just give a little bit of insight into what that looks like. As a consulting forester, I know you get other plans prepared by other foresters, but imagine being a county forester and you have quite literally a stack of 150 plans on your desk on April 2nd. And you need to go through and review these plans. And you go to one plan and it looks like the prescription requirements are satisfied here on the left. The next one takes this different approach on the right. The next plan takes the approach here on the left. The next one takes a different approach here on the right. This one here on the right has it in a table format, doesn't have it in a stand summary format. The manual doesn't preclude that per se. And so this is what the county foresters struggle with. And in some counties, it's harder than others because there are some counties where there are fewer consultants preparing plans than others. But as a statewide program, we're not in a position to kind of have the rules set one way in one county and another way in another. We really need to be consistent in what the expectations are. This also is really important for distribution of workloads. We have some counties that have 700 UVA parcels enrolled, others that have 1,600 UVA parcels enrolled. And what that means for what their job is and how they do their work, there's a really stark difference. And if we're able to distribute the workload because things are handled consistently from one county to another, it makes a really big and positive difference in shifting that around and really supporting the ability of services in one county to be the same or similar to those in another. And so that's why we're creating the template structure. And as we mentioned before, I think the template structure is one way that self-certification is advanced. It's also really helpful for plan review. Previously, we had talked about template being an online submission process, but we felt that with such a big need to update the UVA manual and a lot of benefit potentially from getting the template in place and having some IT barriers to doing that in an electronic submission, we felt that we could get the majority of the benefit of a template if we just were able to articulate what was required in the manual itself. And so at this point, basically the template is providing all the required elements in the order that they're prescribed in the manual and having a heading in a consistent format preceding each of the required elements. And that can be done in different ways by different consultants. That could be done linearly, as kind of shown here on the top. Or it could be done, if stand number 1 is the first requirement and mapped acres is the second requirement, if it's to the right of it, that's still being provided in the order that they're in the manual. If as a forester, as a plan preparer, you wanted to include additional information, you could insert something in that between these sections, between mapped acres and enrollment category or so on, and that's okay. You can do that. But after that, you would go to the next required element. And so there is flexibility to adapt the template structure to your needs, but it still needs to meet, as long as it meets the orders and the kind of identification of each required element. Then we've got these examples of that support self-certification. One inclusion here is use value treatment history. And this is basically providing a brief table that says what was prescribed in the last plan, or what was prescribed in the last plan and has it been implemented. We recognize that this creates some could create some heartburn for consultants because there's some judgment involved in this. At the same time, we've received plans that wholly omit reference to any activity that has occurred in the previous plan or tries to change stand boundaries to obscure what's occurred within a previous stand. These are things that, as far as self-certification goes, create some red flags for us. But I think that if we put something like this on the table, it creates some ease of administration, creates some accountability for the landowner to have implemented their plan, and so that's one important aspect. And another is AMP implementation status. With a lot of the water quality stuff that's going on, we need a little bit more clarity about what this current status of AMPs is on enrolled properties. And we want to set things up where folks are accountable to addressing the AMPs. For some situations, if there's an ongoing discharge or there's a bridge that's been left in a brook, the plan might be a trigger to say that's got to happen next field season. That's got to happen right away. In other cases, and we see this a fair bit, where there's a road that's in place, it's stable, it's gone through a couple of seasons and hasn't had major washouts. We don't see a risk of erosion or discharge in the very near future. We might say AMPs aren't implemented, but it's stable. At the next entry, let's get these water bars in. And so it kind of is honest about what is urgent, what is reasonable. This will take some work to iron things out, but this is basically extending the standards that were incorporated into reserve forest land into the current standard. In terms of what is different, I'm going to focus on the plan elements, or the sections of the plan. On the cover page, we've included the submission type. Previously, we haven't done that, but if a property is enrolling conservation land or reserve forest land, we need to be able to track those. There are both legislative requirements and processing requirements that help us kind of put it into the right stream for that. So we're including that. The parcel overview includes who's the legal decision maker. People do include that already, but making sure it's clear that that's required. Also, as I mentioned, the aquatic overview, AMP overview, and RT&E species are included as part of that. The stand summary has these additional elements. Many of these are already being provided in plans. Many of them are already being required in certain enrollment categories. There's a broader requirement to unify some of them. One of the things we've wrestled with is the approach that some of the standards have taken in the past have been, if the enrollment category is this, then here's the requirement. And if it's a different enrollment category, then this is required. That's really appropriate in some cases. In other cases, it creates confusion about what's required and when. And to the extent that a requirement is reasonably met, regardless of the enrollment category, and is useful, regardless of the enrollment category, we thought it was appropriate to apply it to all so that there was less variability in what was required depending on the enrollment category. The management objectives don't really have any changes. The prescription, there are some elements here that are new. Many of them are implied requirements under the current standards. Some of them are new. Again, these are mostly aspects where these are elements that would be included in a narrative of a prescription that says, here's how I'm going to employ this treatment. But instead of just saying describe the treatment, we're asking for specific elements of that description. And so in many respects, we're reducing the need for the narrative and increasing the need for specific descriptive elements for this. So again, as you cruise through the manual and you're looking at what has changed, why have these things changed? Many times these elements have often been included. We're not just making something up, but and so we perceive that to be a relatively low cost, but they've also had a lot of value because they've been included in interpretation of the plan. So as I mentioned, they're valuable for consideration of the prescription. Some of these, they mandate critical but too often omitted information. What's the past management? How are the AMPs doing? What's happening with the invasives? These pieces of information are critical to basically alignment with the management standards, or eligibility requirements, or evaluation of the prescription. An omission of them limits our ability to ensure that, and the confidence, and I think in some cases the integrity of the program. So I think that reverses that a bit. Again, some of these strengthen the confidence in our ability to speak to the fact that UVA is truly advancing its statutory goals. And in many cases, it exchanges unstructured narratives for succinct statements, and that increases the objectivity of review, and I think the efficiency of review. So the next steps, I think the biggest next step is January 24th at the Canadian Club at 8:30. We're going to have an input meeting. That meeting is going to spend a little bit of time in the morning doing a reintroduction. We'll walk through some of the changes more specifically, and then we're going to kind of break the manual out into different sections, and we'll have folks who are attending able to join conversations about specific sections of the manual. In each section, it'll be kind of a subgroup. In each section, there'll be folks from PLAC, folks from FPR, and folks will be able to discuss recommendations for improvement or get a better understanding. So for example, stand descriptors might be a subgroup, and folks who are wanting to talk about that could go talk about that for 20 minutes or some period of time, and then move to another group once they've both voiced their provided their input, and once they've got some questions answered, they might go then to the eligibility section or things like that. So we're working on the structure and fine-tuning it, but we'll have a chance to have some focused conversations about certain aspects of the manual during that meeting. We're looking to have input by February 16th, written input. We will begin to integrate input as soon as we're able. Some stuff is recurring, but by having it this deadline for February 16th, that allows us to spend a couple of weeks integrating it. We'll work with PLAC to do that based on what they've heard, and then we need to get it to the commissioner for her review. And ideally, April 2nd, we have the standards in effect. That's our goal. It's a quick turnaround, I think, from this point. But I think that if we aren't able to do that, then we're waiting an additional whole year. I don't have any question that we can get these dialed in by April 2nd. My hope is that there is capacity to review it on the commissioner's end. That's kind of dependent on the legislative busyness and so on. So, but that's our goal. We'll move it if we need to, but that'll set the table for self-certification, able to really be talking about that in the next biennium. If we aren't able to do this, then self-certification could be delayed further, and I think that would be a cost both to consulting foresters and to FPR if we are able to pursue it. We'll work on ongoing training. There will be some changes in this that I think, to the extent that we're able to help interpret those, provide additional guidance is appropriate. I think we're totally game for that. And then, we're a decade or more than a decade after the last manual release. Our goal is to make refinements to this annually and have April 2nd have a new release of the manual, so that we can have incremental changes and have kind of a continuous process for these improvements, as opposed to really getting paralyzed by the scale of improvements needed and then waiting another 10 years till things really get out of hand to pursue it again. So that's the goal, is to create a continuous process for these improvements. And I think getting to the goals, if we're successful in that, then you and we are able to get out in the woods more and do the things that we feel like are really at the core and core of our work, why we came to it in the first place, and really supporting the administration of UVA in the state and forestry. With that, conclude the presentation. Thanks all. And so at this point, we've got 10 minutes. Open the floor for any questions. And again, I'll remind folks at this point, we're focusing on overview. If you want to use an example that from the manual that is specific, fine, but we're not going to be wordsmithing it, but open the door for any questions or comments, so on. Jonathan,
I have one, Keith.
Yeah, bring it.
A real general overview question. Is this manual going to work both ways? Both your and Carbo's presentation indicates that this will create a much better dialogue with the county forester. Are you saying that if you provide everything in here that's been required, that's it? The county forester cannot ask for additional information?
I'm going to say yes and no. And I'm going to say yes and no for this reason. I'd say yes, because I think that this information, when it aligns, and what exists in the stand, what the stated management objectives are, and what the prescription is, align and can be reasonably referenced to silvicultural standards, we should be good. These are the elements that we're asking for that have in many cases been omitted, but it will not be eliminated. And there is still the need to be able to say this aligns. And if somebody is saying, I am going to release all the suppressed trees in this stand and remove the overstory, and we've got nothing but a beech understory, and I'm managing for sugar maple hardwood, we are going to say, great, you met the elements, but it does not meet the silvicultural component. So if there's a misalignment among some of the components, just because you wrote something that satisfied the plan element doesn't mean that we're going to approve it. But I think that it creates a clearer path for when there's alignment, we have all the information we need.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Carbo, is there anything that you'd want to add to that?
Yeah, I think, Woody, the catch that in having all these discussions was that there's no way, and we run into this in other states with that are perceived to have simpler processes, not always the case. Ultimately, there's a discussion about the justification and appropriateness of treatments. I think we've all seen plans that got approved that we question, wow, this doesn't make sense, any more than when we run into situations when why is our prescription being challenged? So what we're hoping is, and one of the things we really had in-depth discussions about is, where are those points, if we could put in another set of data that would help everybody be on the same page, that would achieve what your question basically, was looking for, was, is this now a complete enough set of data to move a plan forward? And I would say that was the objective. And that's why we added a few things here and there. But that doesn't mean that if somebody has a 6-inch even age stand and says, I'm doing a clear cut to achieve a saw timber product, that there isn't going to be a question that comes up. And I think that's whether it's under self-certification and licensing and your ethical professional responsibilities, any more than if it's under the use value element. And I think we're hoping, and I think looking at the broad nature of the folks on plaque, that, you know, with a healthy amount of skepticism, we fought through that discussion point to get to where we are now. And we're hoping that the consulting community sees that and gives us the fine tuning feedback to make this even better.
Thank you, Jonathan. Thanks, Carbo.
Yep. Thanks.
Got a note from T, concern about the regeneration requirement and the responsibility to regenerate things well. That's something we could talk about on the 24th. That standard hasn't changed. It's clarified a little bit in light of invasive plants and deer browse pressures and things like that. But that's something we can dig into on the 24th. I'm sure folks will bring that up. As you noted in the, there's the regeneration standard, the management standards. There's also the regeneration requirements, the description requirements. On the 24th, right now, as it's written, it's a quantitative regeneration requirement in the stand descriptors. Again, that's intended to unify the requirement. Right now, it's conditioned on what is being prescribed. That would unify the requirement. There has been some alternative approaches that's kind of in between quantitative and qualitative that create an alternative, but we hadn't been able to articulate it. We can talk more about that as well on the in the meeting on the 24th. Any other questions or thoughts? Your brains might be like mine after working for a day on this. One of the pieces of advice I got as I was going into this was like, do a lot of pictures. And it's really good advice. I'm not sure that pictures of text really work to satisfy that, but given that this was a presentation about the manual and about the standards, it was hard to avoid some of that, and while still having it be valuable and grounded in what I think folks are here for. So I think with that, please call me if you want to discuss things. Please write to me if you have a recommendation. Each of the members of PLAC have also said they're willing to talk about this stuff if you feel like you'd rather talk to a consultant about why this feels like an appropriate balance in terms of the manual or what the thought was behind any of the specifics. The registration for the 24th is in the email that everybody used to register for this. Hope you're able to make it, and I will send a note out to you all as well as the broader consulting community about these next steps with more details about how to provide input and so on. With that, I'll wrap it up unless there are any final thoughts, questions. Thank you all so much. I really do hope that you'll take the time to look through the standards, provide feedback, reach out to any of us to discuss it. It's just going to make it better. So thank you.
Thank you, Keith. See you next week.
Thanks, everyone.